Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for McMaster University's Master of Public Policy in Housing Policy Capstone presentations. These presentations reflect the culmination of the hard work and the diligent analysis that have been undertaken by our inaugural cohort of housing policy MPP students over the past year. Each of our students has selected an emergent problem in housing policy and endeavor to work through the policy model in such a way as to articulate a recommendation to our judges, to our audience, and hopefully to the broader policy community. We are just waiting on our on two of our judges to join, or excuse me, one of our other judges and our faculty lead for the housing policy stream to join. So I'll ask everyone's patience for maybe one more minute while they connect. In the interim, though, I'm going to take this opportunity to quickly introduce our judges who have joined us or who are on the screen with us. So I would like to warmly welcome to our MPP program our judges listed here in alphabetical order by surname. So I would like to start with Samantha Di Bologna, the policy manager for Matry, also an MPP graduate herself, among many other accomplishments. To Claude Gautreau, bienvenue et merci for joining us here today. Claude is the Senior Manager of Research for the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. We're grateful, Claude, to have you here with us to share your insights with our students. We also have such an illustrious career and number of titles. I didn't know which one to choose, Janet, but I welcome with great pleasure, and it's an immense privilege for us to welcome Janet Hope, who, among many other accolades, is currently a senior advisor at Strategy Corp. Thank you so much, Janet, for taking some time to be with us here today. I've also noticed that our faculty lead, Professor Jim Dunn, has joined the group. Thank you so much, Jim, for joining. And perhaps you are with Steve Pomeroy. Could you just unmute maybe, and we'll...
Yes, we are. Yes, Steve and I are here, and we're just trying to get the camera to work here on Teams, which might take me a second.
No problem. Thank you very much for working through the technical challenges that with which we're often beset in these types of presentations. But I would like to welcome Steve Pomeroy as well, although he's not visible on camera as yet. I'm sure he will be in short order. Among many other achievements, titles, and accolades, Steve Pomeroy is currently serving as executive advisor and industry professor for CHEC, the Canadian Housing Evidence Collaborative here at McMaster University. He also serves as a professor of practice in our MPP program. So we're delighted to welcome you, judges, to our capstone presentations. We have each of our students will be presenting for a maximum of 10 minutes, although we've asked them to target 8 minutes. We have 15 minutes allocated for each student presentation. Each of you judges has received a roster in which you are assigned as first or second reader. First reader will be the first to respond to a student presentation to offer feedback on that presentation. We've asked students not to respond to feedback directly unless a question is asked, so that we preserve as much time as we can for the judges' insights. But if you have a question of the student or of a presenter that you'd like an answer to in order to help inform your view of that presentation or your score, please do feel free to ask a direct question, and we'll give students the opportunity to respond. But we have... Hi, Steve, and welcome. Low tech still works for us, Steve.
I see that, yes.
So we are, and we would ask judges, all judges, whether you're first or second reader, we ask all judges to provide a score using the scoring system assigned for each presentation. Those scores will be aggregated to determine the prizes that are awarded for this capstone presentation. So in order to stay to time and without further ado, I'll just very quickly walk you through what the Capstone model looks like so that you have a sense of what we've asked our students to do. We have asked our students to define a policy problem, to come up with a problem definition for a current problem in the housing market. So this is not a policy evaluation. We did not ask for a historical analysis of a past problem. So it's an emerging or emergent or continuing problem in housing policy. So we asked them to define the problem, to set policy goals or objectives, which can be the evaluative criteria against which they analyze their policy options. They need to identify innovative policy options or alternatives, conduct an analysis of those alternatives, and make a recommendation to you who will serve as the decision maker. So they'll be addressing you as decision makers and presenting you with their overall analysis and looking for your expert feedback and guidance as they continue on in this journey. So with that said, we will move to our first presentation. I will just set up the spotlight.
Can I just ask a question to the judge?
Yes.
Is there in terms of the scoring, what's the score out of? And what kind are there certain criteria we should be looking for?
So it was laid out in that email that I sent you earlier, which is that it's a 0 to 10 scoring range. And I've explained a bit of the evaluative criteria in that email, which is just to say that we're not doing weighted criterion by criterion scoring, but an overall evaluation of 0 to 10.
Yeah, I saw that. I just wondered if buried within that 0 to 10, there are actually things we can use this. We think what the score would be. I don't remember seeing anything that kind of explained that.
I think we're looking for your intuitive evaluation of the strength of the recommendation and the evidence that's presented by the students that inform that recommendation.
Okay, all right, I'll work with that.
So we defer to your expert judgment.
All right, no worries. Give everybody a 10, maybe good.
All right.
You see why they like me now.
Of course. Wonderful. Well, thank you very much, everyone. We're going to move to our first presenter, which is Iman. Iman, I'm attempting to give you control of the screen now. I appreciate your patience. You should have it, Iman. Oh, but you're muted. Or at the very least, I don't hear you. I'm going to hope that I'm the only one, but...
No, we can't hear him.
Hello.
There we go.
Now we can.
Yeah, that works better.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Okay, am I good to go?
Yes, go.
Okay, perfect. Good afternoon, and thank you for being here. My name is Iman Kaur, and today I'll be presenting on strategies to mitigate housing insecurity among low-income older adults in Halton region. My focus is on the most effective and feasible policy responses at the municipal level. The core problem that I'm addressing is the growing housing insecurity that is facing low-income older adults in Halton region. This is driven by a fundamental mismatch between fixed income supports and the local housing costs. Older adults rely primarily on standardized programs like old age security, guaranteed income supports, Canada Pension Plan, ODSP, and Ontario Works. These benefits do not adjust to regional housing markets. And at the same time, rents in Halton are now averaging over $1,900 per month, far above what these programs are designed to cover. This creates an extreme vulnerability. When an older adult experiences even a modest income disruption, most often the death of a partner and the loss of survivor income, there's no policy mechanism in place that stabilizes their income or their housing. As a result, income loss quickly turns into arrears. Arrears escalate into eviction, and eviction often leads to homelessness and shelter use during a time of difficulty and grief. Importantly, this is not because supports don't exist, but because the system responds slowly, usually after the crisis has escalated into an eviction. To address this problem, any effective policy intervention must achieve 4 connected objectives. First, identify risk earlier. Before arrears spiral into an eviction. Second, respond quickly, ideally within 60 days of an income disruption. Third, prevent housing loss following income shocks. And fourth, reduce emergency system reliance and crisis service usage. Together, these objectives form a clear chain of impact. Identify risk early, respond quickly, prevent eviction, and reduce emergency use. This framework reflects both the lived experience of older adults and what is realistically within municipal control. The first option is maintaining the status quo. Under this approach, older adults continue to rely on the standardized income supports and the fragmented service pathways. There's no shock responsive system, and there's no mechanism for early identification. While this option is administratively simple, it performs poorly across all 4 of the objectives. Support arrives too late, arrears accumulate, and many older adults enter the homeless system unnecessarily. The status quo serves as a baseline, but it clearly fails to prevent predictable and preventable crises. Option 2 is targeted housing stabilization. This provides time-limited rent supplements or arrears assistance to older adults that are experiencing shocks to prevent their eviction. This option performs very well on preventing eviction and reducing shelter entry when it's delivered early. Small short-term supports are far less expensive than downstream emergency responses, making this approach highly cost-effective. However, the critical limitation is timing. These interventions only work if older adults are identified and reached quickly. In the current system, many people aren't connected to support until arrears are already unmanageable. So while targeted housing stabilization is a powerful tool, it is necessary but not sufficient on its own. Option 3 is rapid response and service coordination. This approach focuses on fixing system failure through delays and fragmentation. Rapid response would create a centralized and coordinated intake and triage process and integrate early warning indicators, such as benefit changes through OW and ODSP, bereavement notifications, rental arrear reports through the LTB, health system referrals, and community agency alerts. This option performs strongly on 2 objectives that also trickle down to the other objectives. First, it significantly improves responsiveness, reducing the time between an income shock and access to support because of the early identification. Second, it strengthens early identification by shifting the burden from the vulnerable older adults to the system itself. Its major advantage is feasibility. This approach relies entirely on administrative redesign rather than new benefits or housing supply, making it fully implementable within Halton's current authority. The trade-off is that it requires sustained interagency coordination, data sharing agreements, and staff training. But these are organizational challenges and not fiscal challenges. Option 4 is priority access to rent geared to income or supportive housing for older adults experiencing income shocks. For individuals that receive a unit, this option is extremely effective. It permanently resolves their affordability by setting their rent at about 30% of their income and prevents shelter entry altogether. However, the limitation is scale. Halton's waitlist for rent geared to income is currently 5 to 7 years long. Very few older adults can be housed quickly enough to prevent eviction with this intervention. As a result, this option delivers deep benefits to a small number of people, but it cannot meaningfully reduce housing security at a population level under the current conditions. Option 5 is a scaled down income-tested version of universal basic income, designed to stabilize the housing costs for low-income older adults. In theory, this option performs well. Automatic predictable income reduces financial volatility, it prevents eviction before it begins, and it significantly reduces the amount of shelter use. It also performs strongest from an equity perspective by eliminating administrative barriers that may disproportionately affect marginalized populations, like older women, seniors that live alone, and racialized folks as well. However, this option faces major feasibility constraints. It requires sustained funding, CRA data sharing, and provincial cooperation, none of which Halton can guarantee independently. So while a scaled down version of UBI is attractive in principle, it's not the strongest feasible option at the municipal level. Based on this analysis, I recommend that Halton Region adopts a rapid response and service coordination as its primary policy intervention. RRSC is the only option that consistently performs well across all 4 objectives while remaining fully feasible within the municipal framework. It directly addresses the core system failure, which is fragmented response, and improves early identification and speedily accessing resources that are already existing. Importantly, RRSC amplifies the effectiveness of targeted housing stabilization. When rapid response is in place, short-term rent supports are far more likely to prevent eviction and avoid shelter entry. This approach doesn't solve the broader housing income affordability gap, which requires provincial and federal action, but it does significantly reduce preventable housing loss caused by system delay rather than inevitable poverty. In conclusion, housing security among older adults in Halton is not only a problem of affordability, but a problem of timing and system design. By shifting from a reactive crisis response system to a proactive shock responsive system, Halton can meaningfully reduce evictions, lower emergency system use, and better protect older adults during times of vulnerability. Thank you very much for your time and your attention, and I am happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, and I'll invite your first reader and second reader. Just let me get the spotlight working here. So Janet, why don't we start with you?
Great. Thank you, Iman, and congratulations. It's always tough to go first in this kind of event, but really appreciate your presentation and congratulations on being succinct. I know that's one of the toughest things when you are trying to unpack a really complex set of issues. I found your statement of the problem and the criteria we're using quite clear and easy to follow. It resonated for me. We focus a lot on supply, and supply is important, but I particularly appreciate some attention to issues on the income side as well. And I appreciated your clarity on sort of the level of government that you're focusing on and what is within that order of government's control. So all very important features. I'm personally a big fan of the basic income concept, but very much appreciate your analysis that that's well beyond the capacity of a municipality to administer. In terms of your recommended option, I think your analysis of differentiating between sort of what solutions that come at the end, once there's a crisis versus early intervention. I appreciate that, trying to find the right place to intervene, and that your recommended option comes in at that front end. I think there are a host of other reasons why coming in earlier is really beneficial from an outcomes perspective, particularly for older adults, but for any housing insecurity construct. I think my main area that I would suggest you do some more exploration if you were pursuing this, or the main area of question I would have for you as a decision maker trying to move forward, is the degree to which this is easily implemented. I think, in fact, systems coordination, coordinating cross health, other housing, other systems, this is actually something that's really, really challenging. And I appreciate that administrative changes sound easier than fiscal changes, but in fact require a lot of detailed work to unpack how systems are currently functioning, where the problems and opportunities are, and then a considerable amount of partnership and collaborative work to make change. So I just would, I think I like the track that you're on, but I think that that there's probably quite a bit more work to actually make that a really feasible solution. But thanks very much. That was really really interesting to hear your presentation.
Thank you, Janet. And I would say that to reciprocate your compliments to Iman, thank you for going up as our first judge to speak and for offering such a succinct and constructive feedback. I think it's a great model. Maybe I can move to Steve to offer second reader comments, and I'll add you to the spotlight, Steve.
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, I think I would agree with much of what Janet has said in terms of well-organized presentations, succinct, and packaging, as Janet mentioned, a very complex set of issues into a quick presentation. Not sure we necessarily needed five options, but I can sort of see how you're trying to layer them a little bit. I think in terms of defining the problem, you implied that the issue that you're trying to address is one of an income shock, where something happens that basically puts someone at risk of eviction. I think your articulation of the problem of the gap between the benefit level and the actual rents is not so much an income shock. It's an ongoing problem. They're always in a very highly stressful, vulnerable situation. So the lack of income piece is I would say, paramount in terms of the problem they're addressing. And of course, that does get exacerbated when something happens and the benefit gets cut off, or there's the loss of someone in the family that changes their benefit structure, those types of things. Having said that, and I think your recommendation around either enhanced housing allowances or enhanced income through a housing benefit or guaranteed income benefit income, would be the ideal solutions. But I think you've done a good job in rationalizing, yes, but we can't afford to, and there isn't. It does require a big budgetary commitment, and I think also the fact that you've placed, you've positioned this particular proposal as an initiative at the municipal level, the regional government level, and what are the levers and the things that regional governments can do, one of which is they don't have the fiscal resources to do those more expensive things. So I think landing where you have on what is the one area that the Halton region could actually take some changes probably is appropriate given the jurisdictional issues that you've identified. And trying to get those folks to to coordinate the system. I think Janet kind of hit the nail on the head there. It's that, yes, it's great for politicians that here we have a solution that's not going to cost you any money, but it is tricky to change systems and get people who've been working in a certain way in systems that don't speak to each other very well can be tricky. So I think that's Janet's absolutely right in that regard. Having said that, I think you did a very good presentation, very articulate and well thought out. So good job.
Thank you very much. Iman, great job. Thank you so much for going up first and for doing such an excellent job on the delivery. We're going to move on at this point to Kim. Kim, I'm just going to get you in the spotlight here.
Okay, great. Thanks, Clifton. Sorry, I'm just
going to give you control of the deck. Should have it now.
Okay. Wait.
Yes, perfect.
Okay, got it. I just wanted to test it out before. Okay, well, hello everyone. I'm really excited to be here with all of you today to go over my capstone presentation, which is on reducing the backlog at Ontario's Landlord and Tenant Board. So imagine living in a home with black mold and no heat for months or years. This is a reality for too many tenants at the Ontario and Landlord Tenant Board. The problem here is that the board faces a persistent backlog that has resulted in long processing times for thousands of Ontarians, and these delays stem from operational and administrative design failures, which limit adjudicative capacity and create barriers to justice, and this together reduces system efficiency and timely case resolution. So, what we have to do, well, first of all, we really need to improve the retention of experienced adjudicators to maintain institutional knowledge and prevent disruptions in the hearing process. It's also very important to strengthen overall adjudicator capacity to increase the number of cases solved, improve access to hearings for tenants who have low technological literacy and face tech barriers, enhance scheduling and case management to reduce hearing delays, and as well, it needs to be administratively feasible and something that can be implemented within amendments to the ATAGA Act, the Residential Tenancies Act, and recognizing the provinces wanting to remain executive control over the landlord and tenant board. So, what can be done? Well, I will be presenting you with 5 options. The first option is status quo, and this is the current approach that Tribunals Ontario has implemented after the Ombudsman report in 2022, citing mass failures to reduce the backlog. And it involved hiring new adjudicators and staff and maintaining a digital first approach. So some of the benefits are is that in terms of efficiency, there was a 20% reduction in case backlog since December 2023. So we do see some efficiency gains. And it also is feasible in the sense that it remains the current tribunal power structure. But in terms of trade-offs, it fails to retain experienced adjudicators due to short-term notice of term renewals, which tend to be can't be no more than 6 months. And this creates job insecurity for adjudicators and unlikeliness that they would actually stay in their current positions. Efficiency-wise, even though there's more adjudicators serving on the board right now, there has been a case resolution rate that has dropped by 14% since 2018 to 2025. And equity-wise, it underperforms on improving access to hearings for tenants facing tech barriers. Option 2, which would involve forming an independent nonpartisan body to oversee the appointments and reappointments processes at the landlord and tenant board. So the major benefits here is that these reappointment terms will be based on needs and adjudicators' work performance for higher retention of experienced adjudicators. So it will not be subjected to fixed terms, and this will help with minimizing procedural errors and ability to handle technological interruptions that having a higher year of tenure would provide. And it also, but the trade-offs, along with not being focused on scheduling and case management and no authority to improve access to hearings for tenants, it's also unlikely to be implemented due to the Adjudicative Tribunals Acts on the Adjudicative Tribunals Accountability, Governance and Appointment Act of 2009 in order to actually create this body. The next option is to return to in-person hearings. So this would mean changing Tribunal Ontario's directions on updated practice directions on hearing formats to return to in-person hearing delivery. So the major benefit is that this could ensure procedural fairness and participation for tenants facing tech barriers, also allowing with effectiveness that there would be easier access to mediators that can resolve disputes without hearings and strengthen adjudicator capacity, which can mean that there would be hearings that don't even, or there would be cases that don't even have to go to a hearing. So that is also reducing the caseload. However, the major trade-off here is that there would be significant short-term costs again to opening the 44 regional offices. Also, yeah, so major short-term costs. Impact on experienced adjudicator retention is also indirect, and certain groups may still have barriers if shifted to in-person hearings, if they can't afford transportation and don't have access to that either. Option 4 is return to regional scheduling. So this means that currently there's a single provincial hearing queue that sort of hears cases based on application type, but this option would suggest moving back to regional scheduling so that cases based on location are heard on specific days. So what this would do is this would strengthen adjudicator capacity because it allows adjudicators to learn more about certain regions and to learn about, for example, abusive appellants and the ability to stop needless applications from being filed. But it's also more predictable scheduling blocks that would help with preventing overflow that adjudicators may experience from this just centralized provincial block where they have people maybe of one application type moving booked on one day. And also it would mean that tenant duty counsel would not be as likely to be overbooked in certain Zoom rooms. And it's also highly feasible with no legal amendments needed. It would just require the tribunals Ontario's direction. But then the major trade-off would be there would be no new support to help tenants troubleshoot technical issues. It's still in an online format, so the same sort of disadvantages lie for tenants who are more likely to access these hearings on their phone if they struggle with connecting to the internet, which they may also have trouble engaging with the documents. And it only indirectly improves experienced adjudicator retention, which may be difficult to measure. And then for our last option is direct request resolution. So this would be a policy transfer of BC's direct request process for rent arrears. So it would mean that if a tenant has not paid the rent arrears between 5 days of a notice, a landlord can file a direct request form and they can get that back mailed to them within a couple of days. So that kind of reduces the need for hearings for that application type. So the benefits would mean strengthening adjudicator capacity to resolve cases faster because for Ontario, rent arrear applications for eviction are around 60% of the hearings that are heard at the Landlord and Tenant Board. But it would also mean reducing the need of scheduling for these applications or for the need for hearings. But for trade-offs, along with lack of evidence, if it retains experienced adjudicators, the major trade-off is for equity, for disadvantaging tenants by allowing landlords to get an order of possession without a hearing in missing rent applications. And we also see too that BC has the highest eviction rate of any province in Canada. In feasibility, it would likely mean amendments needed to the Residential Tenancy Act. So in terms of my recommendation, I am recommending to return to the regional scheduling process. And why I've chose this is because it improves scheduling and case management to reduce hearing delays at the board, an objective that is given assigned greater weight, given that it would be more feasible than others in consideration that avoids the constraint of amending laws to redirect executive control from the provincial government. It also reforms how hearings are grouped together and assigned to adjudicators to allow for a more even distribution of cases, increasing adjudicator capacity. And just for comparison, in 2018, 7 major cities had an average of wait times that were less than 2 months, while under a regional scheduling model. But there are trade-offs.
Kim, I'm
It's
going to have
hard.
to
Sorry.
cut you off. Sorry, you're at the 10-minute mark exactly.
Yeah.
But I think you managed to make your point well within the time you have. So thank you very much. I'm going to turn it over to our first. Oh, sorry. I'm going to spotlight our first reader on your presentation and invite Claude to offer feedback.
Thank you, Clifton, and thank you, Kimberly, for the presentation. It was obviously on a very important, very relevant topic. In terms of feedback, I thought the presentation was very well articulated. Your ideas were clear. You use very clear and direct language, which makes it easy for the listener who may or may not be fully aware of the message being conveyed to relate to it, to hear it, to understand it, which as a decision maker, policy maker, that's obviously very critical. I would say that the objectives, I think you had 5 objectives. Perhaps it's not a bad idea to condense objectives, because as a policymaker, when I receive hypothetically, it can look a little bit ambitious if there's too many objectives just from a kind of first glance kind of thing. So if there's an opportunity to condense them, that's never a bad idea. It just makes the scope of what you're trying to accomplish appear to be a bit wide. And that opens up a few questions in terms of, how is this going to how is this going to flow? How is this going to be implemented, and so on and so forth. You were very succinct in the way you identified the problem, which is very good, because that allows me to understand it right away and then reflect on the information that follows. I would say that 5 options is perhaps a little bit too wide, because it makes for a lot of consideration in a short kind of presentation on the task at hand, the problem, and how are we going to tackle this. So again, if there's a condensation in terms of bringing some together, that's never a bad idea. The slides were good. I would just make a quick comment that on the option slides, there were icons on the bottom, for example, and it can be a little bit distracting, because as you're talking and I'm trying to look at that and I'm trying to understand how this all links together. So then I'm reading more and listening less, which is not obviously optimal, because the key here is for me to listen and better understand exactly what you're conveying to me, so I can make a proper determination and a proper decision based on your recommendation. So I know we didn't get to the very end. I thought your recommendation seemed very clear. Perhaps it was following, I'm not sure, but on a recommendation, some practical considerations on implementation are never a bad thing, either from a cost perspective, from a timeline perspective, just things to consider, because if I'm to make a decision, the more information I have on what may happen if I say yes to this recommendation or not is never a bad thing. But that might have come after, I'm not sure. But overall, your presentation was good. Like I said, the way you articulated it was very good. You speak very clearly, which is always very much appreciated. So that's kind of my broad overview of your presentation. So thank you.
Thank you, Claude.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I'm going to add Samantha into the mix for second reader comments.
Thanks so much, Clifton, and thanks, Kimberly. I'll echo the comments that I thought you spoke very well, and I really enjoyed your presentation. But for a number of reasons. So first, I want to commend you for taking on a complex topic like the Landlord and Tenant Board. In particular, the issue of reducing the backlog. So kudos to you. It was clear, your audience was clear, and I particularly appreciated you starting from a people perspective. I think in particular, if you're talking to a policy person, when something that's kind of administrative is the topic, it's good to start with the impact on the person. So there are people who are affected when you don't reduce the backlog. This is what can happen, and this is how you would address it. So I appreciated you starting like that, and I think a policymaker would as well. What I would give just for consideration is I thought your objectives were really great and clearly well researched. Like you and even your options were well informed. It was clear you perhaps also did a jurisdictional scan of what other provinces are doing to address issues. But I would maybe take them up or consider taking them up perhaps one more level, so they're a bit general to start before getting into the specifics. So something even like one objective could be reduce backlog. Second could be, improve the tenant experience, things like that, and then you could get into the specifics. But otherwise, just to reiterate, really well-informed and researched options with clearly laid out what the benefits are, drawbacks are. You explored potential legal cost, administrative considerations, which I think is very commendable. The only thing that was mentioned by Claude, which you could explore if you had more time, would be implementation considerations. But again, that's I think you covered a lot, and very impressed by your presentation. So well done. Thank you.
Thank you, Samantha. I appreciate that.
Thank you both. Appreciate your comments. And thank you, Kim, for your presentation. We are going to now invite our next presenter, which is Sawyer, to join us. And Sawyer, I'll just spotlight you. Give you control. You should be good to go.
Just seeing how I flip between the slides. Okay. Perfect. Okay. So I will get going. Okay, so my name is Sawyer Buchanan, and my capstone presentation is on unlocking asset-based capital mobilization within Ontario's non-market housing. So evidence suggests that leveraging even a portion of social housing assets in the GTA could support roughly 350 to 400 million in financing for new affordable housing. And this estimate reflects a subset of the sector, Section 95 and Section 27 nonprofit and cooperative housing specifically, but it points to a broader reality, which is that Ontario's community housing system holds significant asset values that are not currently being leveraged as financial capital. And importantly, this opportunity is not uniform. So this proposal focuses specifically on legacy nonprofit and cooperative housing providers across Ontario, which are generally better positioned to leverage assets due to the low proportion of households requiring RGI subsidies. And now, while asset-based financing is technically possible under the current system, governance and financing frameworks limit how these assets can be used, and particularly at scale. So as a result, capital remains underutilized, providers remain reliant on public funding, and opportunities to expand affordable housing supply are not being fully realized. So to address this problem, I proposed several policy options that are evaluated against 4 key objectives. So first is reducing regulatory and financial uncertainty in asset-based decision-making, which currently acts as the main barrier to provider participation. Second is increasing the uptake of asset-based financing among community housing providers, and particularly in a way which supports new development and long-term sustainability of existing assets. Third is to safeguarding affordability and tenant stability, ensuring that financing approaches do not compromise the core mandate of the non-market housing sector. And fourth is ensuring the implementation is workable
across municipal service managers, which have varying levels of capacity, financial expertise, and risk tolerance. Okay, there we go. So the first option is a provincial governance and risk definition framework. And this approach focuses on clarifying how asset-based financing is interpreted and approved under the Housing Services Act by standardizing approval authority, borrowing rules, and the treatment of financial risk. And in terms of objectives, it performs strongly on reducing uncertainty as it replaces discretionary interpretation with clear and consistent provincial rules. It also performs well on safeguarding affordability, since tenant protections can be embedded into the approval conditions. However, its impact on the uptake of financing is more limited. So while it removes uncertainty as a deterrent, it doesn't change access to capital to reduce transaction costs. And so the trade-offs are that it prioritizes effectiveness in reducing uncertainty and equity in safeguarding affordability over effectiveness increasing financing uptake. And it also strengthens legitimacy through clear rules, but limits the effectiveness in scaling financing. So the second option is a provincial intermediary for financial coordination and risk pooling. And this model creates a centralized body that aggregates demand, standardizes underwriting, and pools financial risk across providers. So the province would establish the mandate and oversight structure while the intermediary applies decision-making within that framework. And so in terms of objectives, it performs strongly on reducing uncertainty by replacing fragmented and case-by-case approval processes with standardized decision-making. And it also performs strongly on increasing financing uptake as aggregation and risk pooling lower transaction costs and enable participation at a broader scale across the sector. And its performance on affordability is design contingent. So without clearly defined safeguards, there is a risk that financial performance objectives could influence decision-making. However, it does perform well on capacity alignment as centralized expertise reduces the burden on individual providers and creates more consistent access across the sector. So the trade-offs are that it prioritizes effectiveness in financing uptake over equity and guaranteed affordability outcomes and feasibility of implementation. And it improves legitimacy through standardization, but depends on design to maintain equity. So the third option is a market-led model. And this approach enables asset-based financing through provincial rule setting and oversight, while leaving the underwriting decisions and financial risk assessment to private lenders and capital markets. So in terms of objectives, it improves clarity at the entry stage as eligibility criteria are clearly defined, but financial outcomes remain variable and determined by market outcomes. And it performs strongly on financing uptake as private capital can scale more rapidly than public coordination models and respond quickly to opportunities. However, it performs poorly on affordability since market incentives do not prioritize tenant stability, and it may disadvantage providers who are serving higher need populations. And it also produces uneven outcomes across the sector as participation depends on the access to strong balance sheets for different providers. So the trade-offs are that it prioritizes effectiveness in scaling financing over equity and affordability and legitimacy of consistent outcomes. And it also improves feasibility through reduced government involvement, but it weakens equity and legitimacy. So the final option is a provider-led capacity model. And this approach supports asset-based financing through guidance, technical assistance, and standardized tools, so think templates, while leaving financial decisions and risk management to individual providers within the existing governance framework. So in terms of objectives, it performs poorly on reducing uncertainty since authority and financial risk treatment remain unchanged. And it has a limited impact on financing uptake since participation is voluntary and it's constrained by differences in provider capacity and expertise. It performs strongly on safeguarding affordability as it maintains the current regulatory framework and doesn't introduce new financial pressures. And it performs well on feasibility as it introduces minimal administrative burden, but this comes at the cost of a limited system-wide transformation. So the trade-offs are that it prioritizes feasibility and equity in maintaining existing protections over effectiveness in reducing uncertainty and increasing uptake. And it maintains legitimacy through continuity, but limits the overall effectiveness. So based on this analysis, I recommend the provincial intermediary model. It's the only option that reduces both regulatory and financial uncertainty and enables asset-based financing at scale through coordination and risk pooling. And it also provides more balanced outcomes across providers compared to alternatives that either limit scale or produce uneven access to financing. And this intermediary could take on different institutional forms, such as a Crown Corp or an arm's length agency. And obviously that would have different implications for its governance. But regardless of the institutional vehicle choice, its core role would be to make access to capital more consistent and predictable. And while this model does require political commitment and introduces institutional complexity, it aligns with the province's role in setting system-level rules and enabling housing supply rather than directly delivering housing. So this recommendation involves clear trade-offs, and it prioritizes financing effectiveness over guaranteed distributional outcomes, as affordability would depend on how the safeguards are embedded within the intermediary's mandate. This prioritization reflects the fact that the current constraints on scale and uncertainty limit the system's ability to grow, whereas affordability protections can be incorporated through policy design. And it also prioritizes coordinated risk management over institutional simplicity, as centralization introduces complex governance and it would require strong oversight. But these trade-offs are acceptable because the alternative models either fail to scale financing or introduce more risks to affordability and uneven access to the sector. So these risks can be mitigated through careful policy design, whereas the limitations of the other models are more structural. So without this kind of system-level coordination, asset-based financing will remain limited to isolated cases rather than a reliable tool for expanding non-market housing. That's the end of my presentation, so I'll pause for any questions you may have.
Thank you, Sawyer. And right on time, I'm going to invite Samantha to offer first reader comments.
Thanks so much. And I want to say, again, I'll start with saying thank you for your presentation. I thought it was really well thought out. You're well spoken and pretty easy to follow. So thank you. I have only brief comments. Would I be able to, go back to the problem, if you wouldn't mind? Yes. So I think first I wanted to commend you on taking on a sort of different perspective, like a systems level perspective from a housing provider, which I think is challenging. So kudos to you for taking on a challenging topic and from a different perspective. We heard from maybe two people perspectives, and now what would a system look like? On the problem statement, I think that you might want to consider, yeah, like the need. I guess I'm missing a bit of the need. Like why do we do it? Because there isn't enough affordable housing. People, housing providers need more financing. Like I think you're there, but just maybe taking it a step further. And then I would say my only other comment in your options was that, and again, this may be my particular preference, is often decks in policy are really detailed. So I was having some trouble understanding what you were saying versus the text, because I think it was a little more higher level. So I would have maybe appreciated a bit more text in the slide to follow what you were saying. But otherwise, I think you had good evidence, good logic. I agree with the recommendation based on what you provided as the benefits and drawbacks. So overall, well done.
Wonderful. Thank you, Samantha. I'll invite Janet into the
Yeah, thanks, Sawyer. A really interesting topical issue. Appreciate you diving into it. I appreciated the problem statement that you were very clear on why this matters. I think maybe what was missing for me was a bit more of what is the nature of the barriers to this happening now. So you're really good at saying, why does this matter? Why, as a decision maker, should I care about this? But I felt like, and this is part of your challenge in doing such a brief presentation on such a complex technical issue. So this is not a critique, it's just an observation that as a decision maker, I had a bit of, although you had some really good objectives, I couldn't link them to a clear understanding of what are the barriers, what's preventing action now on the part of providers. That said, I really liked in your objectives that you included safeguarding the purpose of this community housing, because I think often in this issue, it's risk aversion that has led governments to put programmatic or legislative provisions in place that are actually impeding the ability of providers to leverage their assets. And so that, how do we rebalance, really, I think what you're getting at, how do we rebalance the risk framework to make sure we're protecting the important public benefit and enabling even more of that great public benefit through leveraging the assets. I think my final comment would just be, this is such a technical issue. I'm enough of a housing nerd to know, and have had enough experience in some aspects of the system to know, just enough to be dangerous. I think beyond this comment is sort of beyond what one would expect from a student exercise. But in the real world, when we're really getting into these sort of issues, this is the kind of briefing where there's probably a sequence of briefings with decision makers, because most decision makers aren't going to have the technical expertise that is really necessary to understand and make decisions about how to rebalance that risk reward framework. So kudos to you for taking on something very technical and bringing some initial framing to the directions that governments could consider in further unlocking assets. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for that, Janet. Thank you, Samantha, and Sawyer, congratulations. We will now move on to our next presentation, and I'll invite Jen to the spotlight. And Jen, I will give you control. You should now have control of the deck.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jen Koorneef, and I will be presenting my capstone, Building on Uneven Ground, the Housing Accelerator Fund, Distributional Challenges, and Policy Options for Small and Mid-sized Communities. Let me begin in my hometown, a small but growing city of about 47,000 people, where the Planning and Development Department has just 29 full-time staff, working with a $4.4 million operating budget to guide local development. Now compare that to the city of Toronto, serving nearly 3 million residents with 362 staff and a $48.5 million budget. Despite significant differences in scale and administrative capacity, both municipalities were positioned to compete for the same housing funding under the Housing Accelerator Fund. The $4.4 billion Housing Accelerator Fund was launched by the Government of Canada in 2023 to incentivize local initiatives that increase housing supply and improve affordability nationwide. The application was resource intensive, requiring a data-driven housing needs assessment, a housing action plan, ambitious growth targets, and significant technical expertise, data analysis, consultation fees, and executive approvals, all before funding was even awarded. The HAF includes a small rural Indigenous stream to target communities with populations of less than 10,000 people. However, the HAF's competitive, application-based, and prescriptive design continues to favor well-resourced municipalities. Even with this stream, it does not address uneven local capacity to implement housing reforms, which undermines the HAF's objective of widespread housing supply growth. To address this uneven capacity in competitive funding, a policy is needed that first increases capacity in lower resourced municipalities. Second, aligns reforms with local housing markets to improve fit with local conditions. Third, clarifies intergovernmental roles to reduce fragmentation between all levels of government. And fourth, increases predictability and scale of housing outcomes. The first policy option is to maintain the status quo, which is competitive application-based HAF funding that relies on municipal leadership to align local priorities with federal best practices. It promotes faster development approvals and regulatory changes with clear compliance and output-based accountability. Early reports show it has supported well over 160,000 residential building permits, exceeding incented unit projections. While effective in its 241 recipient jurisdictions, the HAF creates distributional inequities. Housing outcomes depend on municipal capacity, risking slower uptake in smaller and mid-sized communities. Effectiveness is prioritized over equity, as larger municipalities can produce greater supply increases. Prescriptive federal requirements have also sometimes conflicted with municipal priorities and infrastructure. Therefore, the status quo prioritizes supply, but it does not meaningfully fulfill the objectives of increasing capacity or improving local policy fit in lower capacity municipalities. The second option proposes a regional municipal housing innovation stream, encouraging regional collaboration and capacity sharing between municipalities. It allows for innovation and autonomy by replacing HAF best practices with place-based action plans with broad federal oversight. This option proposes local autonomy, innovation, and policy fit over standardization, introducing outcome risks for the federal government. It also prioritizes collaboration over accountability, risking slower decision-making and ongoing equity issues within regions, as can be seen in Ontario's consolidated service manager approach, where reliance on local capacity and priorities can produce uneven outcomes across municipalities within a region. The regional framework improves local capacity and policy fit, but does not address intergovernmental clarity or improve equitable supply predictability and scale. The third option, nonprofit scaling incentives for small and mid-sized communities, focuses exclusively on nonprofit housing. It provides capacity support and incentives to implement reforms that accelerate nonprofit approvals and offers funding for every nonprofit unit that is built within small and mid-sized communities. This option removes the competitive application-based approach of HAF funding, replacing it with a standardized needs-based funding formula. The trade-offs are clear. This approach departs from reforms that target both market and non-market supply, creating output risks for federal funding. It assumes that nonprofit housing providers will be willing and able to scale efficiently, and there is a minimal direct role for provincial governments. On the other hand, it directly advances equity and housing provision within jurisdictions by focusing on affordable supply, and allows small and mid-sized communities a more equitable opportunity to implement these reforms. The fourth option, the FPT Structural Housing Reform Fund, is proposed to improve intergovernmental collaboration, addressing a key gap in earlier iterations of the Housing Accelerator Fund. It places provincial housing corporations in the driver's seat of structural housing reforms, with the federal government providing per capita funding and broad national objectives, and provinces providing operational leadership to municipalities. This enhances clarity in roles and responsibilities while maintaining compliance and output-based accountability. However, this option carries feasibility risks due to the fragmentation in the Canadian housing policy space. Therefore, the FPT option prioritizes intergovernmental collaboration, but involves trade-offs in feasibility and ongoing distributional equity concerns within provinces. It does not meaningfully address the other objectives. Finally, the fifth option proposes an adapted small and mid-sized community stream. Small and mid-sized communities require funding and capacity support and an elimination of applications and competition. This option provides standardized funding based on need and centralized federal support to help jurisdictions develop and implement best practices suited to their local markets. There are trade-offs. This stream prioritizes equity with broader geographic distribution of funding, but with roughly 20% higher per incented unit costs in small municipalities, as well as a reduction in short-term housing supply increases. It also introduces risk as it moves away from standardization. Place-based reforms risk being less effective and more costly than the current half structure. If you're willing, let's return to my hometown planning department. A new federal half initiative rolls out and the department is notified that funding is coming its way. That funding allows it to hire the staff needed to work with the federal government to design and implement housing reforms tailored to the local context. I recommend that the federal government support the small and mid-sized community stream. This option adapts the existing federal approach to address the capacity constraints of small and mid-sized municipalities. This stream exposes a key trade-off: equity and local feasibility versus scale and predictability. Costs will be higher per incented unit and supply growth will be slower. Additionally, the federal government must be willing to modify its traditional compliance-based funding model. But the impacts will be more equitable and longer term. The stream helps make structural housing reforms more widely achievable, and this matters. Small and mid-sized jurisdictions face comparable per capita rates of core housing need, but have far less capacity to respond. Gone are the days of the patchwork of short-term housing supply wins. This option shifts the focus to building long-term capacity across all communities. So how can Canada start building on solid ground? By recognizing that equity is not secondary to supply efficiency. It is the foundation on which it is built. If the half's goal is to increase housing supply nationwide, every jurisdiction, not just those with pre-existing capacity, must be able to implement structural reforms. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jen. I will invite Steve as first reader to respond.
Just trying to figure out how to turn on the mic on Jim's laptop. Thanks, Jen. A very good presentation. And as others have said, I appreciate that all of you folks are trying to squeeze a lot of really complex technical issues into a 7-minute presentation, which is very, very difficult to do. And this issue, like the other ones, is equally challenging. And I think it's, I appreciate that you've decided to approach this from a very personal perspective in looking at your municipality and how it actually is impacted by a federal initiative that is pan-Canadian in its approach. And I think that it's a really interesting assessment that probably the folks in Ottawa may not have thought about. So I think it's a useful contribution to the policy discourse in this area. I think my sense is that you're tending in your recommendations and indeed even in some of your objectives, while your focus is on the capacity in the smaller communities because they just don't have the same staffing levels and resourcing as large communities. You're also leaning in a bit more into sort of seeing the half as a source of funding to facilitate more affordable development as opposed to overall supply. If the cynic in me is if the federal government was basically interested in boosting as much supply as they could, and if they got more of it in big places, then you're just collateral damage in that kind of policy consideration. So I don't really think they thought about spreading it more evenly in the way that you've articulated. I think your choice of or your various recommendations. All of them have useful elements to them. Certainly, scaling the non-market sector is a challenge, as you've indicated, in the smaller communities. You are limited with resources, with local groups with capacity to do things, as well as not really having the funding to do it. So I think you've landed in a very logical place and I think to some extent we see this in the and the federal approach to the Rapid Housing Initiative, where they took the same kind of federal competitive program and sort of said, let's give 50, most of the money or a lot of the money to 15 specific larger municipalities, and then have a separate stream for rural Canada and smaller communities. And I think your recommendation emulates to some extent that approach as well. And I think it does actually make sense to try and see, if we're going to get more housing built, trying to build, a little bit everywhere, than a whole lot in Toronto and Vancouver, which we know how that one's working out, is probably a logical way to go as well. So I think you've landed on a very logical and solid recommendation. Very well presented set of arguments. I like the way you define the problem and how you've actually outlined some possible options for the minister. In this case, I guess it's a recommendation to the federal level. So well done. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you.
I'll invite Cloud to join us with second reader comments.
Thank you, Clifton, and thank you, Jen. Very much appreciated the presentation. I will echo what Steve said in that it's not easy to take a very complex problem and try to synthesize something down to 7 or 8 minutes. So I think you did a really good job to paint the picture, frame the picture, and talk to us about the picture. As a former municipal councillor in a small municipality, I appreciate the personalization angle because it does resonate, because small municipalities and big ones don't operate the same way, and there are inequalities. So the fact that you would discuss that and highlight that, I think is very good. Your presentation was excellent. Your visuals were clear and easy to follow. The way you articulate your ideas was very clear, very direct, very good language, easy to follow, easy to relate to. The only thing I would say, and this is not a critical item, this is more so just an observation and a suggestion. When taking on something this complex, and if you know you only have a few minutes or a short amount of time or a short window to present it, it can be good to have a visual that kind of projects a journey map of where you are, where you're trying to go, and what's in between, if that makes any sense. Because when federal government programs are put together, you know the saying, right? You can't do one thing that's going to satisfy everybody. There's always going to be some detractors to certain things. And sometimes there are forces behind the conception of a program that to those conceiving it, it makes sense. To those seeing it, it perhaps makes a little bit less sense. And when you want to identify certain, whether it be options and ultimately recommendations on how to improve it, and if you have a short period of time in kind of a real world scenario, it's to really hit the points very, very brief and just kind of show that progression through that journey map from, I'm here, I'm going there, I need to know this, you need to know that, and ultimately this is the information I'm presenting in terms of recommendation, and this is the implication of if you make this choice based on what I'm recommending, this is kind of the outcome, or these are the considerations of what might follow. So when I say journey map, I'm not so much looking at a let's say an infographic kind of a visual. I'm just thinking to the person listening to this and trying to make a determination on what decision to make in a few minutes. If you can kind of walk them through a little bit more directly, I think that would potentially be beneficial when it's a complex topic. But you did an excellent job, and I think you had a great presentation. So that's more of a kind of put it in the back of your mind for future reference kind of thing. But overall, I thought it was a great presentation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Claude. Thank you, Steve. And thank you, Jen. We will now move on to Taofikat. Let me find you in here. There you are. So Taofikat, I'll add you to control the deck.
Okay.
Should have control now.
No, wait, there. Okay, now I have it. Thank you.
Great, take it away.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Taofikat, and today I'm presenting my capstone project titled Beyond Emergency Shelter, Reforming Housing Pathways for IPV Survivors in Ontario. The project focuses on what happens after survivors of intimate partner violence leave emergency shelters and why the gap between shelter exit and permanent housing remains one of the most persistent failures in Ontario's IPV response. Intimate partner violence or IPV includes physical, sexual, emotional, or controlling behaviors by a partner or ex-partner, and most survivors are women. Many IPV survivors are able to find short-term safety in emergency shelters, but moving to permanent housing afterwards is extremely difficult. Shelter stays are short, typically around 3 months, while housing wait lists can take several months or even years. As a result, survivors often lose support long before housing becomes available. We can see the consequences of that. 65% of survivors experience housing insecurity after leaving shelter, and 17% return to an abusive partner simply because they have no safe housing option. The policy problem is that Ontario's crisis response system and the housing system operate on different timelines. This creates a timing and sequencing gap that leaves survivors without a stable place to go once crisis services ends. Because of this, survivors cycle through temporary arrangements, hidden homelessness, or return to unsafe environments. Addressing this gap is primarily a provincial responsibility, sitting at the intersection of housing and IPV services, which are governed separately under the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing and the Ministry of Children, Community and Social Services. Importantly, in 2025, Ontario officially declared IPV an epidemic, reinforcing both the scale of the issue and the urgency of addressing system gaps like this one. Because of this, we need policy objectives that address both access to housing and long-term stability. To evaluate the policy options, I used 4 objectives that reflect what improved outcomes would look like for survivors. First, increasing transition into safe permanent housing. More survivors move directly from shelter into long-term housing. Second, improve 12-month housing retention. The 12-month benchmark is used as an indicator of housing durability, meaning placement are stable, safe, and workable over time, and it reflects how well the system supports long-term stability. Third, supporting long-term independence beyond crisis. Stable housing should allow survivors to live independently in conditions that are stable and safe enough to move away from crisis-driven living. And fourth, reducing administrative burden. The transition process should be easier to navigate, with fewer handoffs and clearer steps between crisis support and housing. Using this objective, I evaluated 4 policy options. Option 1, Crisis-Oriented IPV Support Framework. This option reflects Ontario's current approach. It performs well at providing immediate safety through emergency shelters, but offers few structural pathways into permanent housing. Survivors must exit shelters after 3 months and often wait several months or even years on housing waitlists with minimal follow-up support. This option prioritizes emergency protection, but performs poorly on housing access, retention, and continuity. The trade-off is that while it provides immediate safety, it does not address the structural timing gap that causes instability after shelter exit. So while option 1 protects survivors during crisis, it does little to support them afterwards. Option 2 focuses on administrative coordination. Survivors receive designated caseworker and clearer referrals across IPV and housing system, reducing confusion and paperwork burden. However, housing access rules and waitlists remain unchanged. This improves navigation, but does little to alter housing outcomes or timing. The trade-off is modest, improving at relatively low cost with limited impact on long-term housing stability. To meaningfully improve outcomes, the timing of housing access itself has to change. The third option, priority access and stabilization pathway. This directly addresses the timing and sequencing gap. Survivors receive housing prioritization early, starting at shelter intake, so housing planning begins immediately rather than later in the process. Stabilization support such as rent supplements and case management continue after placement. Together, these elements improve both access and durability. increasing the likelihood that housing is stable and safe over time rather than temporary. Importantly, this model incorporates survivor's choice. Survivors are not forced into the first available units and can choose housing locations that support their safety. In terms of objective, this option delivers strong improvements in transitions and retention, moderate to strong gains in long-term independence, and a moderate reduction in administrative burden. The trade-off includes higher costs, increased coordination requirements, and potential to extend wait times for other priority groups. Overall, it creates a clear and realistic pathway for shelter to stable housing. The next option considers what a fully integrated response could achieve. Option 4, Integrated IPV Housing Pathway. This option represents the most comprehensive model. It creates a single coordinated system from shelter intake to permanent housing, with automatic prioritization and full integration across services. Survivors can remain in shelter or transitional space until permanent housing is secured. This model also includes survivors' choice, ensuring placements are appropriate, stable, and safe. In terms of outcomes, it performs strongest across all 4 objectives. However, it requires major institutional restructuring, long implementation timeline, and substantial new funding. So while this option performs best in theory, it poses significant feasibility and political risk. Given these trends and trade-offs, the next step is identifying the option that offers the best balance overall. I recommend option 3, the Priority Access and Stabilization Pathway. This option improves access to permanent housing, strengthens retention, and reduces repeated crisis cycling. Importantly, it does so within existing governance and funding structure. The core problem is the timing gap, and this option directly addresses the gap by aligning housing access with the moment survivors enter shelter. It ensures survivors move into housing faster, placements are more stable, survivors retain choice, which supports safety, and fewer people return to the crisis system. Unlike option 2, this approach changes actual housing outcomes, not just navigation. Unlike option 4, it can be implemented in the short term without major system overhaul. There are trade-offs. It may extend wait time for other priority groups, requires coordination and staffing, and depends on housing supply. There is also uncertainty. Research shows that some survivors return up to 7 times to their abuser before they finally leave. So some survivors may return to abusive relationship before housing placement is complete. Even with this risk, these options offers the strongest balance between effective and feasibility. This approach requires coordination between the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing and the Ministry of Children, Community and Social Services, with implementation carried out through municipal housing service managers. The guiding principle behind this recommendation is simple. A policy that can be implemented now and meaningfully improve housing stability is more valuable than a theoretical optimal model that cannot be delivered in time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Taofikat. I'm going to invite Janet to respond.
Thank you. Thanks, Taofikat, for focusing in on a really significant issue for what you've clearly outlined as a very vulnerable population in our housing system in Ontario. I really appreciated that. I think both in your problem statement and in your objectives, you've highlighted some data points. And this is, I think, really important for decision makers who are facing a lot of challenging, competing decisions, that the more we can, there's 2 kind of tactics that you and your colleagues have used. One is data, hard evidence, and the other is sort of the storytelling, that kind of making the data personal. So I applaud you in bringing forward some of those data points, which are pretty, eye-opening if someone is not familiar with this population and what their experience is with respect to housing. I also appreciate you've picked an issue and highlighted that it is engaging 2 different provincial ministries, and that a big part of the challenge is in the coordination or lack of coordination between the roles and accountabilities of 2 different administrative structures. So really important thing to highlight, and that's something that makes this in an academic sense, in addition to the real sense, an interesting problem to try to work through. in terms of your options, I think I applaud your, analysis of saying here's as I heard you talk through your options, your final option was kind of an ideal state. And this is really where we'd like to be, or you would like as the advisor, you think it would be great if we could be, but there are some practical reasons why we're not going to get there overnight, or there may be other impediments to decision makers making the investments and other changes required. So I appreciate, and I think it's a valuable tactic to lay out for decision makers a sense of here's where an ideal end state might be that would really fully address the issues we're highlighting. And here are some steps to move us in that direction, start to make a difference, even if this ultimate end goal feels a bit unattainable in the immediate term. Because if decision makers can see, okay, because many really do want to solve the problems, right? Like they're there wanting to solve the problems, and if they can, and it's not very comfortable as a decision maker to feel like you can't solve these important problems. But if you can see and if you can start to paint for decision makers pathways towards those bigger, more ultimate solutions, that can be a very positive thing. So thank you. Lots more. Love to have a conversation about this in more detail, but those are a few off the top comments.
Thank you very much for that, Janet. We'll add Samantha.
Yeah, I would echo Janet's comments. I thought they were really great. So also great job, Janet. But thank you for this presentation. I have to say, taking on this particular topic is really challenging. And what I also appreciate about this is that you took not only the person's perspective, but the type of housing they're in, so emergency shelters, and the end state of moving them into permanent housing. So it added a bit of complexity, I guess, but it made it more specific. So as a policymaker, I could follow, what the issue is, where they are, and where you want them to be. I also I thought your objectives were the right level of kind of detail and high level that would be appropriate for a policymaker. And I appreciated the mix of visuals and text that you used throughout the presentation. And I would just echo what Janet said, and it reminded me of Claude's earlier comment on implementation. You presented just to reiterate, what you would ideally want to happen, but what is practical and realistic. You could take it a step further if you wanted to consider doing this, but this would be, again, you're constrained and you have to pick one option. Some sort of a phased implementation, like this is what you could do right now, but this problem isn't solved completely by this, and you may want to think about X, Y, and Z in the long term. But overall, really well done, good topic, good use of evidence, and good logic throughout. So great job.
Thank you.
Thank you, Samantha and Janet. Congratulations, Taofikat. Thank you for that presentation. We will now move onwards. I will just set up for our next presentation, where we will have Olivia join us. Apologies, Olivia. I'm just getting this set up and giving you control of the deck. And you should have control and be ready to go.
Perfect. Let me just give it a whirl here. Of course, the cursors aren't working.
Let me try one more time and see if I can.
Sure, that'd be great.
Reinitialize control. I don't see your cursor either, so I'm going to very quickly try to reinitialize the sharing. This worked last time, so let me just reinitialize the sharing and try one more time, and otherwise I'll serve as your navigator. Did you get control?
Oh, here I do. Let's see. Oh, perfect. Beautiful. Thank you very much. Much appreciated. Good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to present. My name is Olivia Duke. Today, I'll be discussing a policy challenge related to supportive housing delivery and presenting a recommendation to improve outcomes for individuals experiencing chronic homelessness. This recommendation is directed toward the federal government, particularly in how it coordinates housing funding and implementation with provincial and municipal partners. Okay, hold on one second. Now it doesn't want to, oh, here, perfect. The core problem is that supportive housing is not being delivered reliably, even when individuals are ready to be housed. To illustrate this, the breakdown occurs here in the system. At the top, we have homelessness programming, particularly Housing First, which is designed to move individuals into stable housing quickly. Below that, we have individuals who are ready to be housed. But the system breaks at this point in the middle. Supportive housing projects depend on municipal approvals, multiple funding streams, and coordinated timelines. When these are not aligned, projects can be delayed for years or fail to move forward altogether. Evidence across Canadian jurisdictions suggests that these types of delays are common. For example, in Newfoundland, over 100 housing units were announced, but most had not yet begun construction, illustrating how projects can remain in the pipeline without reaching delivery. Similarly, reporting from Manitoba shows that even when investment is being mobilized, it does not consistently translate into the delivery of deeply affordable housing. While public data on waitlists and delivery timelines is inconsistent across provinces, the overall pattern is clear. Housing need is high, but projects do not always move predictably from planning to completion. In some cases, a project may have funding secured, but still be waiting on municipal approvals, or receive approvals, but face delays in aligning capital funding and construction timelines. This means that projects can remain in the pipeline without progressing to construction or occupancy, even when key components are in place. As a result, even when individuals are ready to be housed, appropriate units are not available. So the issue is not simply one of program design, but rather a breakdown between homelessness programming and housing delivery. To address this problem, we need policies that achieve three key outcomes. First, we need to improve the reliability of supportive housing delivery, meaning that projects consistently move from planning to completion and occupancy. This matters because delays or failures at any stage can prevent housing from reaching individuals who are ready to be placed. Second, we need to better align housing development with homelessness programming so individuals are not left waiting for units that are delayed or unavailable. Without this alignment, even well-designed homelessness programs may fail to translate into housing outcomes. And third, we need to reduce pressure on shelters and crisis-based systems by enabling earlier transitions into stable housing. Over time, prolonged reliance on emergency systems increase costs and reduces overall system efficiency. Together, these objectives reflect both what success looks like and what is realistically achievable within the current system. They also reflect the trade-offs inherent in this policy space, particularly between speed, scale, and long-term stability. I use these three objectives to evaluate four distinct policy options. While these objectives are closely related, they capture different points in the system, from delivery processes to system coordination to downstream outcomes. The first option is a program supply calibration, which aligns homelessness program targets with available housing supply. In practice, this means setting program expectations based on the housing that is actually available in a given market. This improves alignment between homelessness programming and housing supply by creating more realistic placement targets. However, it does not address the underlying delivery constraints. Projects can still be delayed by municipal approvals, funding coordination, and construction timelines. So while this option improves alignment, it does not improve the reliability of housing delivery, which limits its effectiveness in addressing the core problem. This improves alignment, but it doesn't fix the delivery problem. The second option is a durability strategy, which prioritizes long-term housing stability. This approach ensures that individuals remain housed and do not cycle back through shelters or emergency systems. It performs strongly on reducing system pressure by lowering rates of re-entry into homelessness. However, it introduces a key trade-off. In supply-constrained markets, prioritizing long-term stability can reduce the number of individuals who can be placed quickly. So while this option improves long-term outcomes, it can limit system throughput and delay access to housing for others. This improves long-term stability, but limits how many people can be housed quickly. The third option takes a more structural approach. This option is supply enablement, which focuses on expanding the supply of deeply affordable and supportive housing. This approach directly addresses the structural housing shortage and has the potential for the greatest long-term impact. It performs strongly on increasing housing availability and improving long-term system outcomes. However, it faces significant feasibility constraints. Expanding supply requires substantial public funding, access to land, and lengthy development timelines, often involving coordination across federal, provincial, and municipal governments. As a result, while this option is highly effective in theory, it is less feasible within the current policy environment, particularly in the short to medium term. This addresses the root problem, but it is the least feasible in the short term. The fourth option takes a different approach. This option is a delivery de-risking strategy, which focuses on improving how supportive housing is delivered by addressing key implementation barriers. In practice, supportive housing projects rely on multiple steps, including municipal approvals, capital funding from different sources, and construction timelines, which are often not aligned. For example, a project may receive municipal approval, but still be waiting for aligned federal or provincial funding. Or funding may be committed, but delayed by permitting or construction timelines. These gaps create uncertainty that can stall projects or increase costs, even when all the necessary pieces are technically in place. Importantly, these challenges occur even when projects are funded or approved, which suggests that the issue is not only supply, but how projects move through the delivery system. This strategy improves coordination across approvals, funding, and timelines to increase the likelihood that projects move from planning to occupancy. As a result, it performs strongly on improving the reliability of housing delivery and better aligning housing supply with homelessness programming. The trade-off is that it does not significantly increase the total supply of housing, but improves the performance of the existing system. This doesn't solve everything, but it makes the existing system work reliably. Based on this analysis, I recommend a supportive housing delivery de-risking strategy. This approach performs most consistently across the objectives by improving the reliability of housing delivery and better aligning housing supply with the homelessness programming. In doing so, it directly addresses the core problem identified earlier, that supportive housing is not reaching individuals reliably, even when they are ready to be housed. It targets the implementation barriers that frequently delay or prevent supportive housing projects from reaching completion. While more ambitious supply-focused strategies could generate larger long-term gains, they face significant fiscal, governance, and timing constraints, which limit their feasibility in the short to medium term. The trade-off is that this approach delivers more incremental improvements to housing supply, prioritizing consistent delivery over more ambitious but less certain outcomes. However, it offers a much higher likelihood of consistent implementation within the current system, which is critical for achieving measurable progress in the near term. It also creates a stronger foundation for future supply expansion by improving how projects move through the system. Expanding supply remains essential to addressing the root cause of housing shortages, but improving delivery ensures that existing and planned projects actually reach completion. In the current policy environment, improving the reliability of supportive housing delivery is the most actionable and feasible way to improve outcomes within the existing system. Thank you. I welcome your feedback.
Thank you very much, Olivia. I'll invite Claude as your first reader to respond.
Thank you, Clifton, and thank you, Olivia. Thank you very much for the presentation. It was very informative. I will say that hold on one second, I just lost my notes here. Bear with me 1 second here. So thank you for your patience. I just lost my notes. I clicked on the wrong tab here. The presentation was very good. The problem was very well defined. I very much appreciated that you identified who the recommendation was for. You identified federal government officials or the like. I thought that was well placed. I really liked the slide of what the policy must do. So you defined the problem and then you kind of went one level beyond. I thought that was very useful. The options were presented very clearly, very succinctly. You use very clear language, very easy to follow what you're saying. You don't kind of put in too much information. It's the right level of information in terms of what you're sharing. The only item I would mention as an opportunity that you can consider is, for example, on the option slides, there's a fairly large portion of the slide that had just kind of a visual, like the wavy green lines or what have you. So that's real estate that I think you could leverage to, because you'd mentioned something like certain gaps, feasibility constraints, and those kind of things. I think for the benefit of the person hearing the presentation, if you had in the form of a kind of a short, like either a table or a little window or something, almost if you can imagine the presentation equivalent of a Post-it note that says, you know, key feasibility constraints, key takeaways, key opportunities, since you have the space on the slide, because I think the way you presented the option it's very good, it's clear, it's direct to the point. But because you have the extra space, it's something you might consider leveraging to just add a few of the key things that you want the person hearing this to take away from it, over and above the points you had on the options and the recommendations. So like I say, not being critical, just putting that out there as something you might want to consider, just to add to it, to augment the power of the message, so to speak. But generally speaking, I thought the presentation was very well laid out, very well delivered. It flowed really nicely, very easy to follow. So yeah, the only thing I would do is perhaps add a few of these pieces of information you want to make sure that the reader, the listener walks away from and retains.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll invite Steve to join us and offer his feedback as well.
There you go. Good. Sorry about that. Using an alien laptop, James. Thanks, Olivia. Very good. I think the point Claude made there about adding, using some of the real estate on the slides was well a good point. You cover a lot of material when you're talking through it, and it's the listener trying to absorb it all. Having some sort of keywords up there, helps the audience, better capture what it is you're trying to say. So that's a good point from Claude. I should say, good presentation on your part, articulate, nicely laid out, succinct, concise slides, with the exception of the point that Claude and I just made. Was good. I think one of the challenges in this issue that you kind of glossed over, and it gets back to Janet's previous point, is using the evidence and the data to help make the case. I think one of the challenges here is not just sort of a system coordination thing. It's just we have a lot more need and demand for supportive housing spaces than we actually are able to produce. Absolutely, if we can improve system collaboration, better alignments, certainly between the real estate, the housing side, and the support side, we can improve that. At the end of the day, I think we do have a mismatch in terms of the number of folks kind of in the shelter system that are chronically homeless and even aging into chronicity, versus the number of new supportive placements that are possible. So that I think is a big constraint that you probably want to highlight, and then focus on the fact that, okay, but how can we then reduce that gap by looking at the kind of system changes, collaboration stuff you're talking about. I think in your identifying your different options, increasing supply, obviously, your third option was a good one, but which we know it's expensive and also challenging to line up the supports that you need. It's not just the housing, it's the support piece that's critical. And I think the other sticky wicket on this, of course, I think as you talk about, and sort of that you de-risking, is really the misalignment of different levels of government and different silos within each level of government. And that getting that support piece, the housing piece, we had examples, we talked about this in class last fall, in terms of the Rapid Housing Initiative and the failure of the federal government to negotiate ahead of making the announcement, to get the provinces on side with being willing to provide the supports that were critical for those new real estate to actually be successful and housing folks coming out of the shelter system. So the FPT dynamic, that interjurisdictional piece, is a tough nut to crack. Maybe Janet should have been the one talking on this one. She was in some of the discussions. It is a challenge, and so I think it's one that we can't lightly overlook. But I think you did a very good job of sort of laying out that stuff, identifying the idea of de-risking, and you might also sort of go beyond just de-risking. I think it is focusing a bit more strongly on this. How do we create a better set of relationships and interjurisdictional collaboration, a more collaborative model rather than we do this, you do that, and never the two go talk to each other kind of stuff. So I think you're absolutely on the right track. Just a few little tweaks there, and well presented, and well done.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Steve. And thank you, Claude. I will, as a brief administrative point, I will say that due entirely to the failure of the chair to keep time, we are running about 10 minutes behind, and I expect that we'll finish up at 3:15, which is 10 minutes later than we had originally scheduled. To our judges in particular, and I'll identify Claude and Janet directly, because you are our first and second reader on the final presentation, which might run a little bit over. If that impacts your schedule, please do let me know. Thanks, Janet. I appreciate your time and your consideration. And anyone who has to leave at the 3 o'clock mark, by all means, we understand competing obligations. So as not to delay us any further, I will move on to the next presentation, and I will invite Menahil to join us for her deck. And Menahil, I'll give you control of the screen. Is it working? All right. Wonderful. Go for it.
Amazing. Can everyone hear me okay? I've had a few issues with my mic in the past. Hi, everyone. My name is Menahil. I am going to be talking about my capstone, which is on housing newcomers and working to reduce newcomer shelter usage in the Greater Toronto Area. Amazing. So despite Canada's immigration efforts in the last decade, refugees in the city of Toronto make up majority of the population in city-administered safe sites, including emergency and transitional shelters, 24-hour respite sites, and drop-ins, signaling a structural problem that is rooted in both inaccessible provincial housing and settlement service availability. At the same time, annual immigration numbers are established by the federal government based on national priority and economic development goals. And so, to target this issue, in 2024, the federal government announced a national annual immigration cap, citing strains on housing, social services, and the job market, indirectly blaming individual newcomers as opposed to a structural failing. This does not address provincial housing availability, which indicates an additional policy problem rooted in disconnected governmental objectives and systemic housing barriers. The lack of a federal, provincial, and municipal coordinated policy approach has led to increasing tension on an already strained housing system, leading to rising levels of newcomer homelessness and shelter usage. And while supply-side interventions such as shelters and housing support are successful as short-term solutions, newcomers in the City of Toronto require sustainable solutions to address the conditions that lead to long-term shelter usage in the first place. And so to address this problem, any policy intervention set in place needs to meet 4 main objectives, which are reducing the number of newcomers entering shelter sites by 35% by 2040. The policy should facilitate improved alignment between federal intake objectives, provincial housing availability, and municipal shelter capacity or settlement capacity. It should also increase the number of available and affordable housing units in Ontario by 10% in alignment with the CMHC's housing supply gap estimate. And lastly, the policy intervention should reduce existing strain on local housing and shelter systems in the GTA so that they can better serve the populations that rely on them. In my analysis, I've identified 4 possible options with roots in structural changes to newcomer intake streams as well as housing development. Option 1 looks at addressing shelter usage and strain by linking federal immigration intake numbers to Ontario's settlement and housing capacity. Ontario would only receive intake approval by meeting pre-approved capacity benchmarks based on vacancy rates, existing availability, as well as healthcare access, and failure to do so would mean that newcomers are delegated to other provinces. This aligned collaboration framework would enable provinces and municipalities to better prepare shelter funding, settlement capacity, and services. However, there are a number of trade-offs for this option. One, it does not achieve the objective of increasing the number of available housing units in Ontario and only addresses one side of the problem through a broad solution. It also poses potential governance disputes over how capacity might be defined or measured, which could politicize intake decisions and create regional inequalities, and undermine national immigration coherence and create federational challenges. And without complementary housing supply expansion, this policy risks being marginally successful without addressing infrastructure conditions that lead to shelter usage in the first place. There we go. Moving on, option 2 seeks to eliminate shelter usage and strain by restructuring immigration processing around housing readiness. Federal intake numbers would be sustained, but admissions into Ontario would be conditional on, similar to work visas, a verified housing plan with arrival timed to coincide with housing availability. This, unfortunately, also does not directly increase the number of affordable and available housing units, and it poses extensive humanitarian concerns surrounding newcomer intake, specifically refugee claimants, backlogs for vulnerable populations, and biases towards which groups of newcomers can be approved. It also relies heavily on retention. Evidence from regional programs, such as provincial nominee programs, suggests that without other adequate factors such as employment availability, community connection, etc., secondary migration back into the GTA would be likely, which does not help reduce shelter strains within the city. Option 3 would aim to shift the lever to provincial performance by linking immigration intake and delegation to funding shelter outcomes. Federal intake would remain the same, but Ontario's immigration streams would depend heavily on its success in reducing newcomer shelter usage through increasing shelter capacity. And while this does reduce newcomer shelter intake and improve intergovernmental alignment, it does not increase the number of housing units at all, since it focuses solely on shelter capacity and usage. Shelter usage is an imperfect proxy for core housing need, which is typically defined by affordability, adequacy, and suitability standards, rather than temporary homelessness alone. The policy would require updated, robust, and timely data linking immigration streams to long-term housing outcomes, and while feasible in principle, this would entail moderate to high administrative complexity and implementation time. So option 4 is a combination of the last 3 policy. Oh my gosh. Sorry about that. Option 4 is a combination of the last 3 policy alternatives. It seeks to reduce the number of newcomers in the shelter system, as well as reduce local shelter strain by requiring that Ontario meets new housing development quotas before being approved for further newcomer intake. In doing so, it facilitates intergovernmental coordination across all levels and directly increases the number of affordable and available housing units. The trade-offs of this policy would also be rooted in economic capability. Reducing the number of immigrants coming to Ontario will have negative effects on our workforce by reducing new participation in the labor market. There would be some humanitarian concerns. Some newcomers would be escaping precarious situations at home or be seeking new opportunities in Canada or to reconnect with their families. And reducing and prolonging this intake would affect our ability to support them and slow down settlement. There would also be some legislative concerns. Currently, provinces are able to nominate entrants into their immigration system, while Ottawa controls national numbers. A policy like this would require formal agreements and consultations to ensure that no responsibility is encroached. And based on this analysis, I would recommend that the federal government implement a national immigration policy that aligns intake numbers with predetermined housing milestones. I recommend this policy for a number of reasons. One is that it aims to achieve all 4 established objectives with clear mechanisms and thorough collaboration between federal, provincial, and local governments through formal agreements between housing and immigration departments. It also shifts the blame from individual newcomers to provinces, creating incentives for the province to invest in housing out of humanitarian and economic concerns, while addressing Canada's housing shortage by encouraging housing development on a performance-based scale. It also encourages meeting housing quotas that aims to support Ontario's economy by addressing both supply side and demand side complications. And some of the humanitarian concerns would be appeased knowing that newcomers are entering a more sustainable and dignity-driven system. There could also be formal policies set in place between Ottawa and Ontario that could be made to ensure that emergency situations, newcomers escaping violence, or family reunification could be prioritized. through programs similar to the provincial nominee programs, waitlist, or humanitarian appeals. Lastly, legislative complexity would be mitigated through robust consultations, furthering intergovernmental collaboration. Immigration reduction alone will not solve this issue, which is why it needs to be done in tandem with housing development. Encouraging housing development will ultimately lead to more available housing for those living in the province, making more affordable options open to newcomers and Canadians alike. Thank you very much for your time, and I welcome your feedback.
Thank you, Menahil. I'll invite Steve as your first reader.
Thanks, Menahil. Yet another complex problem in a short period of time. Well done in squeezing that in. And also another one where, you know, the elephant in the room on many of these discussions, of course, is the fact that we've got a federation with multiple levels of government with different levels of responsibility, all running into each other's way, or not necessarily coordinating and aligning as well as they could. So I think you've done a very good job of sort of defining what the problem is, with one exception. I think when you talk about the sort of the targets for immigration, one of the challenges in this particular area is, while we can set specific targets by economic class, we can set specific targets for international students and temporary foreign workers, in the area of refugees and asylum seekers. That's a flow that is less easy to set quotas on, and in the kind of world we're currently living in, you know, we are seeing situations globally that are causing higher flows of refugee populations, which does put new pressures on the system. Even if you had a system, as you've indicated, with a set of milestones and formal agreements on who's doing what, being able to manage that unpredictable inflow, I think would still be an issue. So I think that's, you know, one of the considerations you would want to include in sort of acknowledging, as you're setting out the options, that we're trying to improve the system.
I'm not sure if it's only me who lost sound.
I think, lost you, Steve, a little bit.
Doesn't seem like the mute's been activated, but maybe the mic. Maybe, Steve, just for time's sake, we'll invite Janet to join us, and then we can see if that can get resolved. Thank you for your patience.
Thanks. So building on Steve's comments, you know, I think one of the things that strikes me, you know, through your presentation as well as some of the others, as we look at population-specific housing challenges, they're complicated in the current environment by those overall challenges of supply. So I commend you for, I mean, it's really hard, but I commend you for that sort of trying to unpack and match up, okay, notwithstanding the overall supply issues, and while governments are working hard to try to address overall supply issues, how do we ease the challenges faced by specific subpopulations? So appreciate your, you know, sort of trying to weave through that. And I think the other issue that your presentation highlights is the intersection of housing policy with these other, often quite appearing to be quite different policy objectives, legitimate policy objectives of government. And, you know, we've seen the lack of that sort of consideration of intersection across a number of areas. So again, kudos to you for, you know, trying to illuminate and bring those pieces together, which is very challenging, particularly in the federal, provincial, municipal policy and implementation world we live in. A very minor picky point, but I think when you got to your recommendation, you weren't specific about which, you used language, but not the number of the option you were recommending. And just for the person listening who's hearing all of this for the first time, it's a simple thing you can do to just help make sure that the person is following the bouncing ball. But good job on another very complex topic. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Janet. And Steve, it seems like we have your audio back as well.
Yeah, you can hear me okay now?
Yes.
I played with a few little buttons and something happened. I'm not sure what. So apologies for that. Yeah, I can't remember where I was, but I think one of the things I was going to say was you've identified under your objectives what you want to achieve. In terms of improving alignment, improving the supply and the extent of the system. One of the considerations, and it goes back to one of the earlier presentations, is that we're trying to solve many of these problems by providing more housing. And the reality is that for many of the asylum seekers and refugees, their ability to actually secure housing is largely to do with the lack of income. And can we think, broaden out the options to think about those two types of things as well as just providing homes for folks. And the other piece, I think, is you may want to think about whether, in addition to intergovernmental alignment, what's the role of the community sector in terms of the immigrant service type organizations that are critically important in basically being the interface that these folks meet with, and they help them. We certainly saw in the Syrian refugee crisis a number of years ago, where individual neighbors were getting together and collectively kind of sponsoring a refugee, and that may be part of the solution there as well, just as a suggestion to broaden out some of your options. But otherwise, well presented and good analysis. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Janet, very much. As Janet mentioned, we are over time. I appreciate everyone's patience. I just want to very briefly say to our students, congratulations on your excellent presentations. To our judges, we are grateful for you taking this time out of your very busy schedules to share your insight, your wisdom, your guidance with our students. This is how we build bridges between university education and the practical education necessary to build careers as public policy practitioners. So thank you so much for your generosity, and we hope that you will stay close to the MPP program and that you will perhaps be bridges in other ways for our students as they go from this graduate program into the workforce and into the world of policymaking. So we're very grateful to you for your time and your energy and your patience. With that, to ensure that you can move on to your next meetings, we'll wrap up and say thank you to everyone. Congratulations and have a great rest of your day.
Congratulations, everyone. Great afternoon. Thank you.
Good job, everyone.
Great job. Thank you so much.
Good work, students. Too bad we can't be with you to take you out for a beer afterwards, but that's what it is.
Indeed.
Thank you so much, everyone. Cheers.